Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MPA-IPA event on Levelling Up. So the UK is, by some measures, one of the most geographically unequal developed economies in the world. While cities and large towns in the greater southeast of England are among the most productive and prosperous places in Europe, most in the north and the Midlands lag far behind. So the government has set up its intention to address this inequality and level up underperforming and left behind parts of the UK through a programme of infrastructure development, investing in education, skills, science and R&D. So it's great to be with you all in the last of the series of IPA and MPA events. For those who haven't joined us before, my name is Gabriella and I am a project delivery advisor in the IPA and will be hosting these discussions. We will be hearing from an exceptional and diverse government and industry panel on their experiences and wisdom on levelling up. In this session, you will hear case studies and insights around the success factors in this area specifically, and have the opportunity to ask any of the burning questions that you have on the subject to our expert panel. We had around 600 people registered for this event, so despite only seeing 7 of us on this screen over the course of the event, there are many others joining the event who you can also engage with through the chat function on this platform. I encourage you to share any questions you may have for our esteemed panelists too, as we move into the discussions for this event. We also have some polls that we will pull out the responses from to feed into the discussions to make them as interactive as possible. So I think that is enough from me. I will now introduce the first speaker for today. He is the Interim Strategy and Programme Director at Transport for the North and will be giving a short case study presentation on One North and the development of the region through transport to give further context for our panel discussion today. So over to you, Tim.
That's great. Thanks ever so much, Gabrielle. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to listen and participate this afternoon. As Gabrielle said, I'm going to start with a really short case study about Transport for the North and hopefully set the scene a little bit about levelling up. What is it? What does it really mean from a northern perspective? And then go on to talk very briefly about Transport for the North and the way in which we've really tried to tackle this, particularly from an evidence and analysis point of view, and how we're building this into the development of a northern investment pipeline for transport infrastructure, as well as major projects like Northern Powerhouse Rail. I've got a few slides. I'm going to go through them at full speed because there's ever in this area, there's far more that we could share and talk about than there is time today. So I'm going to go really quickly. For those who don't know, Transport for the North was established in 2016 as a subnational transport body, and in 2018 became the only statutory pan-northern subnational, call it what you like, body, really set up with the aim of transforming the transport connectivity across the north of England to both as an enabler of economic growth, to support rebalancing and the levelling up agenda, and to really drive a step change in the productivity, in the opportunity, in the prosperity of the north of England. It's been a really exciting project to be involved in. We're now 5 years in. We've built a really strong evidence base around the case for transport investment, and that's largely what I'm talking to you about today. Sorry, slight pause on the slides. I'm there now, and I think most people understand in broad terms what levelling up's about. For us, and where the whole idea of the Northern Powerhouse came from was started from a productivity question and a productivity challenge, and in particular how that then translates into economic opportunity, standard of living, and income disparity between the north of England and other parts of particularly of England, particularly the southeast, but really across the whole of the UK, and really the recognition that transport connectivity has a phenomenally important role to play in all of that. And really that's what we are there to do, to both set the scene and set the long-term vision for the way in which connectivity, both for people, for businesses, for freight and logistics, can really transform the economic fortunes of the north of England. Absolutely working with a whole range of sectors, with businesses, with both with central government and with our local partners, to bring that vision to life, to look at the specific transport interventions that are needed. So that's kind of TFN and what TFN is about. But we're effectively an organisation which, because our entire genesis was around the need to level up and rebalance the UK economy, that actually all of these issues have been really ingrained into everything that we've done since we were established, and really it posed some really big challenges for us about what is levelling up and what does success look like. What are the kind of transport interventions that are really needed to drive that kind of real step change in economic prosperity and outcome. So I'm going to start with a bit about rebalancing and what it means from our perspective. I'm stealing shamelessly in the next couple of slides. Both of these come from work by the 2070 Commission, who, if you haven't come across before, was led by Lord Kerslake, is a small but perfectly formed organisation that actually has produced a really beautiful, very rich evidence base about economic and social imbalance across the UK. And these two charts really just tell the story, both about the way in which the economic gap between the north and the southeast in particular has stayed persistently high over a very long period of time. So we're not talking really about a short-term economic gap here. We're talking about inequalities that have persisted for a very long time and now absolutely endemic and embedded within the economic geography of the UK. And as we heard at the beginning, actually it's the level of imbalance and variation in economic performance across the UK which really makes us unique, set against virtually every other industrialized advanced economy globally that you can think of. A couple of years ago, the Bank of England did a really nice piece of work, and their chief economist did a lecture at Sheffield University that I Google it and read it if you haven't seen it already, because I think that both in telling that story about not only the economic inequality across the UK, but also what it means for differences in social outcomes, in well-being, in wealth and assets, in life expectancy. Just both the social experience is so embedded alongside that economic inequality. So some lovely cartography that the Bank of England did to really sort of draw out all those things. And transport, as we know, is right at the heart of this, and a real difference in, particularly about access to opportunities, ease of access, the distances that people are able to and willing to travel to access those opportunities, which are so distinct between London and South East and London in particular. You can see the chart on the right hand side. Actually, London and all the English regions, but there's also this disconnect between parts of the South East, and that's really where the cartography really starts to get some really odd looking pictures. I think that is just about Great Britain, but transport right at the heart of this, not the only driver of inequality, and I will pick that up in the discussion as well. But that access, it's that access to opportunity for people that's absolutely essential. So for us then, it's really been that connectivity challenge that we have centred on, and TFN's strategic transport plan really then brings together how does that connectivity really help drive the economic outcomes that we're looking for, but also across a range of other factors, particularly social inclusion, decarbonisation, well-being, quality of life, quality of place. All these issues really do come together, and connectivity is a great vehicle for actually thinking about them as a concept. So our strategic plan does all of that. Particularly important, I think, that we're thinking about those connectivity challenges as not just being between the major cities the English regions, but also a wide range of different places. And part of how we've tackled this has been about both to define levelling up in our own terms, but also then to get into that very detailed spatial approach to understanding all of this. I will speed up because I always end up talking too long about this. In terms of defining the challenge, the most important document has been the independent economic review of the Northern Powerhouse, and that the one thing that we lack in the levelling up agenda is a formal definition. The IER for us at least gives us what does closing the productivity gap between the north and the rest of England really mean in terms of economic outcomes. And so both as a conceptual sort of economic strategy, but also as giving us a set of technical forecasts that we can work towards, we've been able to quantify that, and that's been really powerful in framing both the strategic transport plan, but everything we're doing in terms of transport appraisal and business case development. So we define the size of the prize as a really important first step. Second, we've got heavily into the detail, the spatial activity that's going on across the north. And I don't know how large this chart looks to you, but actually understanding that the key economic centres and economic assets of the north go right across, as I said, not just in the cities, but right across the north, and quite spatially diverse. Economically really important. Absolutely, these 7 prime enabling capabilities are effectively the sectors which offer the route to transforming productivity in the north, but actually joining them up, allowing businesses to giving businesses access to new markets, improving labour market opportunities, allowing people to live and work in different places, and to access all sorts of different opportunities, absolutely at the heart of driving this. So understanding that very disparate spatial concentration across the north is really important. And then the next step really was then to recognise that we needed bespoke tools and models, both transport models and wider land planning, land value, and social models as well, to really get at a very detailed spatial level why transport can drive that step change and opportunity for people, as well as then model how people might react to those new opportunities. So the maps here are really just to give you that sense of very detailed spatial level at which we're operating. I'll keep going through, and then linked to the modelling, a real strong programme around user insight, but I think effectively really getting to the heart of what do we know about the lives of people who live in the north. How can we bring in both the economic challenges they face and the connectivity challenges that they face, but also to understand the strengths and the opportunities. If we can get more people connected to more places, how can we design infrastructure that actually allows people to really benefit from new opportunities, whether they're occurring in city centres, in rural areas, in all parts of the north. So lots of segmentation, lots of understanding social and economic characteristics, and then building that systematically into the work that we do. And these are now the sort of the personas that we use are now embedded into absolutely everything that TfN does. Loads of work on future travel scenarios. Lots of people have got really into foresight and the long-term future, but over the last, certainly for us thinking about the next 30 years, having a really wide range of different scenarios that take into account all sorts of socio-economic transport factors. And again, I could talk for hours about that, but won't. The key for us now is we're now at the point where we are bringing all of that together. So when we're looking at detailed transport appraisal, when we're trying to optimise what kind of transport interventions, are needed across the north. We're now in a position where we can bring that together and show that very directly to decision makers and stakeholders. This is unpublished analysis. I'm going to be fairly careful with it, but particularly in the context of Northern Pass Rail, where we're looking at quite complicated and wide-ranging combinations of different transport infrastructure, we can drill down and then bring all that work together, so that really for any combination of transport intervention, we can show absolutely the distribution of benefits across any kind of characteristics that we need to. And I think we're now probably at the first time where we've had that very powerful, very flexible modelling tool to enable us to do it. But it does mean now that genuinely social inequality and levelling up is right at the heart of every decision now that TfM will make in future, because we've got the analytics sitting behind that, so that actually we can take a whole range of decisions based on and really sort of build on the promise that's there in the new Green Book that was published at the end of last year. The tools that TfN have put in place really enable you to get at those really core questions about social inequality and a wide range of issues. I'm going to pause there because I always say I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes, and I suspect that was more like 20. I'm really sorry. So I hope that gives you a sense of where we are and what we've been up to. Really happy to pick up questions in the discussion, but otherwise, thanks ever so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tim. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm actually especially interested in the impact of economic gaps on social outcomes, which continues to be a really big and important discussion. So looking forward to picking that up in the panel going forward. And with that, I would like to invite our second presenter, Helen Boyle, the Regional Development Manager at Cadent Gas, who will be sharing another short case study from the Hynet Project and its net zero and decarbonisation pathway. So welcome to the virtual stage, Helen. Over to you.
Thanks, Gabriella, and good afternoon, everybody. Really interested to hear what Tim had to say. That was a great presentation, and I think you only actually talked for about 10 minutes, Tim, so you're all right. But I'm pleased to follow Tim really with that, because energy infrastructure goes hand in hand really with transport infrastructure and ensuring that you maximise all those opportunities together in terms of planning all of that and underpinning the opportunities that it all presents. So what I'm going to do first and foremost is let me share my slides. This is one, I'm not brilliant with tech. This works. I hope you can see that. So a little introduction to me. I'm the Regional Development Manager at Cadent, and I look after the Northwest and the West Midlands network operating areas for Cadent. Quite a newbie still, so I've only been with Cadent since the beginning of November, but prior to joining, I actually worked for Electricity Northwest, the electricity distribution network operator for the Northwest region. So I worked there for 7 or so years, so I've got a good understanding on both kind of the gas and electricity infrastructure side of things. So flicking through to a bit of an agenda. What I'm going to talk to you about today, and I've just got a few slides to illustrate this really, is the opportunity that decarbonisation and the transition to net zero actually is creating for the north of England in terms of infrastructure, but also sort of the opportunities that brings with it, given the industrial heritage of the north. So in a way, it's a little bit ironic that the kind of the industry that we have in the north of England and all the kind of negativity as well as positivity and growth and all the good stuff that's come with it, but in terms of carbon emissions and all that kind of thing, is actually for the first time attracting real attention to the north and saying, well, you know, this is what we need to tackle first in terms of the transition to net zero, because that's where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in carbon savings very quickly. It's no surprise, or there is a, you know, there's a reason why most of the industrial clusters that are being developed at the moment are you know, kind of in the north of England, and that's because of the industrial heritage that those regions provide. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about net zero and the role of infrastructure and what that means for kind of the opportunities it presents, and also going to give you an example of whole system thinking that Cadent's involved in, and what that essentially means, and we've seen this happen really more and more in the last 12 months, is electricity and gas infrastructure providers, network operators, coming together to help, whether it's local authorities or regional stakeholders, understand how their infrastructure planning can actually underpin regional net zero ambitions. And everyone will be aware that most regions and local authorities have set accelerated and sometimes quite aggressive decarbonisation timescales, and that all of that has to be actually underpinned by infrastructure investment, which is the role of the network operators, both gas and electricity, to provide. So, and I'm going to give you an example of pieces of work that Cadent has been doing with the electricity infrastructure providers to really help give clarity on that, that's then informing their own network investment plans as well. Then I'll talk to you a little bit specifically about Hynet, which is the industrial hydrogen and CCS industrial cluster that's being developed in Ellesmere Port in the northwest, and then a little bit about, well, what do we need next for all of this to kind of happen and for us to be able to maximise on the opportunities that this can provide in the north of England. So just a little bit about Cadent, if you don't already know. We are the largest gas distribution network operator in the UK. So 85% of customers' homes across the UK are warmed by gas. And there are 8 gas distribution networks, and we own and operate and maintain 4 of them. So serving 11 million plus customers across the UK. So as well as providing safe and reliable gas supply and the emergency response, which is the cornerstone of what you expect from a GDM, we are also leading this transition away from natural gas to green gases, and that's exactly what my role is focused on. So moving away from natural gas and fossil gas, as many people refer to it now, and understanding the role that hydrogen and other green gases can play in that transition. So helping stakeholders, first of all, to get their heads around hydrogen and the benefits that it can bring, and then specifically what it means for them in terms of their strategies and their thinking, and when's it going to come online, when will it become a thing, what sectors will it permeate, and what does government need to do to support all of this. So just building that and taking looking at government focus and that kind of national policy direction around net zero and the part that hydrogen plays in all of that. Obviously, what we had at the end of the last year in November was government's 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution, which you will all be aware of. And on the 10-point plan, hydrogen was number 2. It also showed a big focus for CCUS as well, which is really important as we start with blue hydrogen, and then we see probably transitioning more to green hydrogen when the economics start to stack up. That was backed up shortly afterwards by the Energy White Paper, and then in spring, and we're being told in June, so that's a very late spring, we're expecting the hydrogen strategy. So what we've got is, in the 10-point plan, we've got lots of kind of big thinking and ambitions and support for hydrogen at a quite high level, talking about blending hydrogen into the gas mains from around 2023. There's around 240 million pounds worth of investment going into that, and also looking at hydrogen village and then a hydrogen town. So hydrogen village and hydrogen town fueled on 100% hydrogen, happening from the latter part of this decade. But that sounds great. But when I talk to a lot of people, and potentially people who want to produce hydrogen, and also potentially people who want to use hydrogen across all sectors, what they say to me is, well, how much is it going to cost and where's it going to come from? So in the hydrogen strategy expected out in June, we are expecting to see the government's plan for those economic models that will support the growth of a hydrogen economy. So even in the last 6 months or so that I've been with Cadent, and in my 7 years before that still working in energy, I'd say the last 6-7 months or so have been the busiest for hydrogen and the most kind of focus for it. It seems to be, and we use a very loose term within Cadent, hydrogen is becoming a thing for people. It's becoming something that's on their radar, something they want to really help in those hard to abate sectors, but also to provide the resilience from in a domestic heating situation and environment. All of that takes major infrastructure to happen. So we're all waiting for the hydrogen strategy to be announced in June, and I really, really do expect that's when we'll start to see private investment pouring into the hydrogen economy. And let's be very clear that the 10-point plan was brilliant, and we were really, really supportive of it, but it's private investment that will make this happen. So that's why the hydrogen, really, the strategy is really important there. So that's what we're seeing at a national level, really, around hydrogen, and how that relates. Just a side note on the kind of national point around hydrogen and Hynet specifically. A few weeks ago, Hynet was granted £72 million worth of funding from the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge Fund in order to actually get it to a point where it can make that final investment decision in 2023. So that's another kind of national policy point where all the industrial clusters actually got some money, got some funding to start them off the block. So instead of them becoming kind of a paper project that stakeholders want or get behind, they are really becoming tangible, planned for, proper infrastructure projects that are going to happen. So that money gets them to a point, different amounts for different projects, but for Hynet specifically, it's getting Hynet to a point where a final investment decision can be made in 2023, which really will be here before we know it. So earlier on, I talked about whole systems thinking around energy infrastructure and the important role that plays in decarbonisation. And the next 3 slides are just an example of part of a much bigger piece of work that's I can certainly share with anyone who's interested in how Cadent is working with distribution network operators, so the electricity infrastructure providers, to help them understand what the transition to net zero in their particular region with their accelerated decarbonisation timescale can look like. The important thing about this is this then translates directly to infrastructure investment. Which then creates opportunities for the north of England, local people, local jobs, attracting private investment, attracting and changing national policy direction, regional thinking. This is the basis for all of that from an energy perspective, coming together. And why whole systems thinking is so important is previously what you got is the electricity infrastructure providers doing their own bit of thinking and planning. You've got the gas network providers doing their own bit of thinking and planning. But for a regional body like a local authority or even big businesses that are wanting to decarbonise but don't necessarily know how and where to spend their money and which technology to put their pounds and pence into, that's not very helpful to have separate sets of plans. So around a year ago now, Electricity North West started to work with Cadent to provide a whole system view. So one report, one piece of information for local stakeholders that shows, that provides a possible pathway to 2038 as a net zero target for Greater Manchester that includes both electricity and gas. So what would happen to if you're going to meet 2038 as a net zero target? What needs to happen to electricity? How much will you need to generate locally? What role does hydrogen play in the replacement for natural gas, and in what sectors? When does it become a viable thing for Greater Manchester? And how are you going to see the growth of both of those? And you'll see as well in the if you look behind the pie chart in kind of the different colours, what you see is the role of electricity grows over time. So from that kind of 2020 baseline to 2038, so a demand for electricity practically doubles, but gets greener because the national grid is decarbonising and more locally connected renewables are joining as well. And there at the top, you can see natural gas completely dropping away to nothing by 2038, and from around the mid-2020s, partway through this decade, you see hydrogen coming on board and growing and taking that market share of the the energy supply. And that hydrogen for Greater Manchester is predominantly going to come from Hynet. And what you see as well is you actually see energy demand, and this is overall energy demand, dropping from around 51 terawatt hours to around 39, and that's driven by changes that will need to be made in transport. So moving away from very inefficient technology that are petrol and diesel cars to much more energy efficient ones, electric vehicles and hydrogen powered heavier goods vehicles. And then the role of much more energy efficient heating solutions in people's homes actually sees the demand for energy dropping. So if we just move on to the next slide, this is just, I'll just run through this very quickly as a way of illustrating the work that we've done. So we focus on buildings, transport and industry. And what you can see in buildings for Greater Manchester is on the left-hand side, the bar on the left-hand side is pretty much everything's at the moment on natural gas from the heating perspective, small amount of electricity. And you see that moving over time to a split between electricity and hydrogen. Now, the reason there's that funny little two-way white arrow is because there is still lots of uncertainty as to where that actual line that between the two will end up being, how many heat pumps will be rolled out, how much hydrogen will actually be available in the system by that point, how many people will want to fit a hydrogen boiler rather than have a heat pump. Consumer choice is such a big thing when it comes to domestic heating that at the moment it is quite difficult to say where that line will land. In terms of transport, as we talked about before, everything moving away from petrol and diesel to electric alternatives with a role for hydrogen in the larger heavy goods side of things. Industry in Greater Manchester is predominantly low temperature industrial processes that can be electrified. So you see gas, going away to nothing by 2038, most of it moving to electricity and some role for hydrogen. And the electricity on the far right of the picture is lighting and air conditioning and sort of everything else that you use electricity for. And even that, you see the demand reducing over time as appliances get more energy efficient. Now, to the crux of this is what this has resulted in, this work, a list of actions. So it's important to say this isn't a scenario, it's a pathway. So this isn't a kind of predicted, this is what will happen if everyone sits back and does nothing, or just kind of following national policy. No, this isn't a passive reactive thing. This is a very proactive piece of work that says, if you want to hit net zero by 2038 in this way, these are the 62 things that you need to do between now and 2038 for that to happen, chunked up on this slide in 5-year time periods. You won't be able to read the detail in here, but the important thing is to say there's a heck of a lot to do, and you have to do all of it to hit 2038. So what has happened as a result of this is the Electricity North West in Cadent and the local authorities are working very closely together now to say, how does this inform our investment thinking in infrastructure as an infrastructure provider, but also how does it inform the plans and the strategies and the thinking and the actions of the local authorities and what they need to do? And also, where does national policy need to give us more clarity or indeed change? Where are the barriers that are stopping this stuff happening at the moment? How do we lift the lid on that to make net zero actually really start to take off, to then put the infrastructure in place and provide all the opportunities for the region and the north of the patch? And it's important to say this is an example of one piece of work that we're replicating across our network operating areas, and I've just done the same piece of work for the wider Liverpool City region as well. It's not available yet, working with the distribution network operator for that patch too. So it's about demonstrating how important decarbonisation and that transition to net zero is from an infrastructure planning perspective, and the opportunities that can bring. Just a couple of slides quickly on Hynet, because I'd get a kicking if I didn't, but also it's just the most exciting thing from a hydrogen perspective in the Northwest too. So there's lots more information available about Hynet at the website hynet.co.uk. So this is all about hydrogen production, CCUS, so that carbon capture and storage in the Liverpool Bay area. So from around the middle of this decade, what you'll see is hydrogen production starting to come out of the Ellesmere Port area. And you will see it in phases, taking hydrogen, first of all, to decarbonise the industry in the immediate area, but then also going into transport and heating across the whole of the region, further north into the northwest and also into North Wales as well. And what we want to see really is a Hynet in every region to ensure that we're maximising the opportunities, generating and producing the hydrogen that the UK is going to need to really meet its challenging decarbonisation targets. And how this fits into the 10-point plan, as I talked about earlier. So these are the 10 things that were talked about on the 10-point plan. This is hydrogen. So just so on the 10-point plan, it's talking about targeting 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production by 2030, and Hynet will be producing 3.5 gigawatts by that date. So about 80% of what's being targeted on the 10-point plan, Hynet could actually be providing. And carbon capture is talking about on the 10-point plan 10 million tonnes per year of carbon captured across the UK by 2030. And Hynet is aiming to be capturing again about 7 to 8 million tonnes of that per year by then, which is again 80% of the target. So it's fulfilling a really significant proportion of the ambitions that were set out on the 10-point plan just a few months ago. So that's why really it's so important to the region as an infrastructure project. Just a couple of points on what we need next. So we need the hydrogen strategy, and we need those economic models. We need clarity on how the money that was outlined in the 10-point plan is going to be spent. We absolutely need Hynet to be one of the first 2 industrial clusters to be operational by the middle of this decade. And we need this whole system collaboration. It's much more powerful to have infrastructure providers working together to provide clarity and a single vision of how this can happen, to attract the investment and the stakeholder support to be able to put the infrastructure in place to make all this happen. And what I will also say, and anyone knows me, and Emma will be sick of me saying this, we need widespread consumer engagement around the energy transition and the part consumers play and the choice that they have in order to really kickstart this and make it happen. So I appreciate I've cantered through all of that, but I'm very, very happy to take any questions or at any point provide this information to anyone who wants it.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your presentation, Helen. I won't actually comment directly on your case study, as I don't want to steal any of the thunder from our attendees, who it looks like already have quite a few questions lined up for you.
Right.
I'll just like to welcome our panelists, if you can come on stream. So that is welcome to Nick Smallwood, Fiona Woolston, Emma Degg, and Andrew Meaney, along with our presenters Helen and Tim. So we have a limited time and a wealth of knowledge in this virtual room. So I'm actually going to skip all the bios and dive straight into the meat of our conversations today, allowing for your wealth of experiences to speak for themselves. But do feel free to introduce yourselves briefly and before answering your first question. So with an already steady stream of questions coming in from the audience, the first one I'd like to perhaps pose to Andrew, actually. Let's do that. So the first question that we have from Miranda: does transport still have the same level of importance for connectivity in the post-pandemic world? And perhaps you could speak to COVID impacts more generally in this space as well.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Gabriella. Thanks for the invite to this session. I'm Andy Meaney, and I'm a partner at Oxera, the economics consultancy. I'm actually head of transport there. I think what we have to do in relation to the sort of post-pandemic world, and obviously it's too early to say yet, and we're only just getting back to the pub. The first thing is just a real honesty about what the effects are going to be. I think what we'll be seeing in the next few years is a need to change the priorities, change the types of projects that we're going to need to deliver. We've seen the pandemic hastening a lot of changes in our economy. We're doing this not in the office, we're doing this in our homes, most of us as speakers. I think in fact all of us are, with a possible exception of Nick. But that change to going into the office less than 5 days a week, that is going to have profound implications for the projects that we need to choose to deliver. I'm not saying that regional connectivity is going to be unimportant. I actually think that the sorts of projects that can bring East and West together in the north, or Oxford and Cambridge around where I live, will still be important. But I think, you know, if we're going to be commuting into city centres less, if we're going to be doing less business travel, but we are going to be visiting people locally, going to the hospital locally, popping out for lunch locally, then the type of connectivity that we need is going to change. And we shouldn't forget the fact that transport's productivity story is built on taking lots of people in and out of cities twice a day. And actually, transport's productivity story needs to change and evolve, and the projects that sit behind that need to evolve. That's my view of how our project selection, how our appraisal system needs to change. You know, if someone can get a job sitting at home and using great broadband internet, then the sort of conversation that economists like me have around productivity and clusters needs to change. It needs to change to being around high-speed broadband, and at that point I'd bring in someone from Oxera's telecoms team to talk about that. But actually, and perhaps it's a bit less around transport infrastructure and big transport projects, but definitely transport projects of a different ilk, creating connectivity that's regional and local, perhaps rather than national or intercity or commuting. So there's just a few points there from me on I think how that post-COVID connectivity might need to change the sorts of things we choose and the way we appraise them as well.
So Emma, I don't know if you wanted to follow up from any of Andy's comments.
I suppose the first thing is I still don't think we know quite what patterns are going to be. Will there be an impact on the fare box and how we invest, how we fund transport? Probably. But I think businesses have shifted and are starting to shift. There will be absolutely elements of blended, but actually a lot of businesses say to me, we actually need to get staff back in the office for at least a proportion of the time, because we have seen collaboration, innovation and all of those sorts of things. And particularly, it has to be said, coaching and training for new young starters be really, really hard to do in any other way. The second, perhaps slightly inflammatory thing I'd say, I suppose, is that for a lot of people, they haven't been working from home from broadband. They've been actually going out to work throughout. And certainly for a lot of my members, my manufacturing members, actually there was no lockdown. Actually, those patterns continued. And I think we have to be really careful that we don't lose sight of the important things over the urgent. And it is important that we get people off the roads and onto safe, efficient public transport and are able to link our communities who need employment opportunities with all of the work that Tim was describing before. I sat on the UK 2070 Commission. And this is, as you say, Tim, a really long-term issue. But I don't think we can afford to allow some of the fluctuations that have happened over the last year to necessarily guide all of our short and medium term thinking really about what's needed.
It's really interesting insights there, because it seems like you've both spoken to the infrastructure requirements, but perhaps in sort of parallel work streams, and spoken to the uncertainty that we are likely to stay in for quite some time. I think I saw Fiona's hand raised, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it's just a very quick one. So obviously, looking at the guys through transport, but all of this is about levelling up. And as we already mentioned, about tackling those socio-economic challenges that we have. And I think there was some comments in the chat about how public transport will change as a result of the COVID outbreak. But there's sort of two flips here. We've got, first of all, having the luxury of a car means the luxury of disposable income for a starter. So in those communities where we are having social economic challenges, or those more urban areas where, if you're like me in an old Victorian street just outside Birmingham, you ain't having a car because you can't fit it on the road. There's also an age demographic around, we've seen car ownership decrease in younger generations as well, particularly those who are living in the city. And I think what we just need to not lose sight of is probably within our own groups, we are probably in this room, this virtual room, quite a privileged bunch of people who operate in a certain demographic. Many of us may have cars, and we're also in jobs where we've been able to flexibly work from home. And I think the reality is, even if we go back to, as Emma has already mentioned, it is going to be moved towards blended. But actually, if we consider the groups that we're looking at, who these projects should benefit from a levelling up perspective, public transport is going to remain absolutely imperative for them to live and work. And I think that's we're very focused on work at the moment, but the reality is there's also a whole economy beyond just going to the 9 to 5. There's the hospitality, holiday, entertainment. Those will operate outside of a 9 till 5. And again, still for those who don't have the luxury of their own transport, will inevitably still have to rely on the public transport side. And I think the reality of that during COVID is that unfortunately those socioeconomic groups have, as a result of their types of jobs that they do and their access to transport, has resulted in higher infection rates. So actually, for me personally, going forward and giving a much better option for public transport for those groups is something that is really well deserved, actually.
I want to almost pause the discussion on the socio-economic thoughts that we're having, because I really want to pull that on a little bit later on discussions, but continue the transport thread. So we have a question here from Daniele, which speaks to the very interesting presentations that we have had. And they ask the question, what is your assessment and outlook for electric mobility in the north? And what about hydrogen mobility? So perhaps I can pick up either from Tim or Helen, whoever pitches up first to answer that question.
We just finished looking at this, so only at the end of March the Transport for the North Board agreed the first decarbonisation strategy for surface transport across the north of England, which again was a really big step forward. And so yeah, absolutely, that transition to EV, which again, is one of the trends that has accelerated as a result of the last year. It's something that needs to actually, in the scheme of things and the scale of time that we're talking about here, something needs to happen really quickly if we're to get anywhere near really ambitious carbon reduction targets. I won't answer the question directly. I'm going to answer the question indirectly, if that's all right. I think what our analysis and our thinking and our work with partners has really taken us to, particularly on the road side of things, on cars and HGVs, it's actually the sheer diversity of the opportunity across the north of England, where again the experience of people within cities is going to be very different, and their ability to take advantage of new opportunities is going to be really different from people in rural areas. So how this links with the rural mobility agenda, with shared mobility, with access to services in all sorts of different places, is a really big part of the challenge. And one of the things is, if you look at particularly charging infrastructure, you can already start to see an imbalance. And I think there's some legitimate concerns about, can we really rely on a market-led approach here, or does it need a broader structural planning thing, probably at the regional level rather than local level? Lots of city regions now starting to put plans in place, but again, that connectivity between places means we need a really joined up approach. I could talk about hydrogen, but I think Helen is probably far better placed.
Thanks, Tim. So just to give you an example of some figures, I completely agree with everything Tim has said. So when we did the work for GM, what it said is, if Greater Manchester wants to be carbon neutral by 2038, what that means for transport is first of all, get rid of as many cars off the road as you can do. So, really improve your public transport. But 98% of the cars that will remain on the road will need to be electric by that date to hit targets, which equates to a public EV charging network of 100,000 chargers, and that's just across GM. So that's really quite ambitious in 17 years now. So that just gives you an indication of the actual figures that this kind of thing means if areas are going to hit their targets. We're starting to see more serious conversations, certainly about hydrogen transport now, and I'm involved in a few of them on a regional basis. If you can electrify something, electrify it from a vehicle perspective. But in the heavier goods side of things, It makes sense that hydrogen's got a role to play, but where we're seeing it slowing down, I suppose, and it's impossible not to bring in puns when you talk about transport, is the cost of the actual vehicles. So you can use the same kind of economic model that you would for EV charging points. Is if you can create the demand, then you can create the private investment that puts the refueling infrastructure in place, providing you can identify the land to actually site the refueling hubs. What is very difficult at the moment to get over is the cost of those heavy goods vehicles. So I've worked with local authorities who are looking to decarbonise, say, their bin fleet, because it's one of the, somebody told me the other day that a diesel bin truck, it actually goes about you get about a mile per gallon or something ridiculous out of it. So it's one of the most inefficient vehicles that you can get. But the cost of a diesel bin truck is about 100 grand. The cost of an electric one is about 300 grand. The cost of a hydrogen one is 500 grand. So when you are a local authority, how do you, the delta between an ICE vehicle and a hydrogen and even an electric one is so significant at the moment that actually what we need is pressure on the OEMs to and scale enough of a market to bring the cost down of the actual end vehicles, which was obviously the case with EVs. And initially they were a lot more expensive and the prices come down. So I think we will see that. I think we're on the edge of things, but we're not there yet with hydrogen. We're not where we need to be.
I wonder whether I could almost pivot our attention and hold your thoughts right there so that we can have a look at our first poll to plug into the discussions. To our audience, if you haven't already voted, please do feel free to. It's just right next to the chat function. You should also see on your screen a polls option. And the question that we have posed is, which of the following outcomes of levelling up is most important to you? And we're having quite a spread actually across, but I think we're now sort of centering on option B, which is improved opportunity for all, regardless of background, which currently sits at about 50% of our attendees looking there. I wonder if, Nick, you had any comments on the results that we're seeing from this poll?
Yeah, thanks, Gabriella. For those who don't know me, my name's Nick Smallwood. I'm the Infrastructure and Projects Authority CEO. What's really interesting, Gabriella, we've focused very much in the conversation so far on linear infrastructure. But actually, if you look at the National Infrastructure Strategy, it includes an ambitious agenda that covers significant increase in building of new homes, significant investment in new schools for the future, 48 hospitals, and a number of prison sites. So it is vast in the built environment. And I think that talks to improving education, improving the provision of health services, levelling up opportunities for people going into secondary and tertiary education, and therefore getting the necessary skills to compete in the job market wherever they are. And I think that's really important, that we don't solely focus on linear. It's going to be really important, but it tends to be longer term, doesn't it? You know, it takes quite a while to build a rail infrastructure or a significant road investment. We want to get more focus on some of the near-term benefits, especially as we recover from the pandemic, and get people into work and doing things productively in their local environment against a regional or local scheme.
I'm going to go to the first nod I saw, which is Emma. So I didn't know if you wanted to follow up on that.
Thank you. Nick's absolutely right, but this is knitting of the spaghetti, isn't it? So actually, all of those priorities that we're asked to choose between are actually subsections of each. And that's where, personally, I think it's really, really good outcome-focused project management, focused on long-term outcomes that really matters. Just a really quick example. Hynet that Helen talked about is a brilliant project. There are brilliant energy and net zero projects bubbling up all across the Northwest. The challenge for levelling up is how we can use those, not just as laudable as it is, to deliver our net zero ambitions, but how we make sure those skills opportunities are actually embedded in our schools, are embedded in FE, are embedded in HE, and are open to diverse communities across gender, across all of those things that we all have come to really realise the importance of over the last 12 months. So for me, it's about scale, long-term planning, and actually some really serious cross-sectoral working as well. all of those things that we know is how you can make this stuff work, but it's really hard.
Fiona, you wanted to come in on that point.
Yeah, I really wanted to pick up on Emma's point about the sort of knitting spaghetti, which is something that as a engagement communication specialist I'm often doing for various clients when they're delivering projects. And Nick, your point about, you know, we sort of focused on infrastructure up to so far during this webinar, but actually we at COP Consortium recently did some research on sort of public views on investment in places, and it was really interesting. Essentially, broadly across all the regions of England, you found a high preference towards housing, renewable energy and waste and recycling schemes. And when we looked at whether those views have changed prior and post the reality of COVID, they hadn't. What we consistently found, though, was large infrastructure projects like rail, road, coming down the priority list for the public. And that might be because there were some other quite interesting insights that we discovered from that research. And one of the main ones was for those who are engaged with development is that their expectation around how fast a project will deliver benefits. And we see those large infrastructure projects often struggle to create an identity for themselves which are locally based. You know, if you've got a road scheme that's stretching from one side to the other of a region, it's very hard to align that sometimes to what the local benefits are. And again, if you're saying to someone this scheme will take 6 years, you know, you inevitably get someone who goes, oh well, I'll be dead by then, or well I will have moved out by then and I won't be here. And whereas, as Nick picked one, those sort of built environment are sort of more favourable in some respect, because there seems to be an instant link to sort of benefits and gratification and understanding of the opportunities out of them. But just going back to Emma's spaghetti, it is about linking them all up, because you can't have one without the other. And it is around creating, you know, we have all these separate projects often being delivered by different mixture of funding bodies, private and public. How do we get all those people on a consistent and coherent message with the public, even if from a technical and engineering perspective, they could be very, very different? Because ultimately, if you live locally where there's perhaps a housing scheme, a road scheme down the road, and say a commercial block going up, you ultimately don't care who they're being delivered by. You want to know why those as a collective are going to work for you. I mean, I live in Birmingham, have done all my life. About 30 years ago, we had this process of random bits of new infrastructure popping up in the city, and none of them sort of tie together very well. And then we sort of had the crash, and all the bits in between didn't happen. And I think there are probably some pieces of legacy in other Midlands and Northern towns of when stuff has tried to happen, but it's not quite reached its potential. And we've got some identity and legacy challenges to overcome to really push all these projects, you know, in people's view as being something that's been delivered with a single vision. But I am going to nick Emma your thing about spaghetti. I might use that in the future.
I wonder whether actually, not to allow you to hog the limelight, Emily, but I can come back to you, because I think Fiona raises a really good point around the importance of sort of pulling together or delivering cross-system thinking across business and policy. So you have all of these wonderful policy ideas, but however, how are you actually seeing those being implemented and pushed through? And I wonder whether you would like to speak to that, Emma.
It is how we knit that spaghetti, right? And it is about serious co-design and serious cross-sectoral working, really taking all of the sort of the boundaries and brands off. And that's some of the work the Transport for the North have done brilliantly, actually. And I'm not just saying that because Tim's on the call, but the Independent Economic Review brought those discussions together so people could see those major infrastructure projects in a context of jobs and innovation and assets. I really hope, as structures may potentially change in terms of combined authorities, local authorities and so on, that we manage to keep that scale in the system. And I think business can help with that. We helped to set up a new company called Net Zero Northwest that's chaired by Carl Innes, the CEO of Siemens, over the summer. And that's funded by the private sector, but we sit alongside LEPs and combined authorities to look really about which bits we can who's best placed to implement which bits, really. And what that's enabling us to do, as an example, is to work across with HE, FE and schools with specific examples and numbers around future jobs, around future apprenticeship opportunities and so on, in a way that no one sector could do alone, really. So, yeah, scale, really, I would say.
Hands up. This almost feels like we're in a classroom. I'll start off with Nick, and then we can go back to Fiona.
Just wanted to reflect on the comment Emma made. I think this whole system thinking is the way we're going to have to work collectively between central and regional governments going forward. We'll be publishing a document transforming infrastructure performance, and what's our vision between now and 2030. And the whole focus is actually moving to systems thinking. How do you actually get to the benefit for the citizen of the United Kingdom with a thought about the net zero impact, what happens with linear infrastructure? And it was really pleasing, Tim mentioned the changes that were made in the Green Book held by the Treasury and how government makes decisions on investments. And there was a wholesale revamp that we're all getting our heads around now, which really moves very much away from, does it have a business cost benefit, but does it have a benefit for the citizens of the UK? And how do we take into account growth opportunities? And it's really interesting, I'm heavily focusing on making sure that the HS2 Limited organisation deliver on their project promises. And what's coming out now is, that isn't just about building a railway between the north and the south. It's about being an enabler for growth, for new business, for opportunity. And we're really moving the conversation now to that space and really driving it hard. And I think that's what we're going to have to collectively do to unravel the spaghetti a little bit.
It's just a very quick one. I think from Emma's point, it's really encouraging to hear regions like the Northwest kind of building those collaborations and coalitions between different partners, whether it's public or private, government and local authorities, because actually what we found in our research around people's perspectives on investment in places is that since COVID, there has been a big drop in trust in the government's ability alone for them to make a difference and invest. So we found a lot of people, their pessimism around government investment alone making those localised differences, particularly as you go, looking regionally to the Midlands and North, that becomes more emphasised and more increased. And one of the things we recommended out of this report was the need to build coalitions of partners across those central and local governments, as Nick alluded to, because it gives more confidence to people that this is not being left to one group to deliver, one group that, particularly if you look at central government, can obviously fluctuate, because of the nature of democracy. We have elections, funding gets changed, people's jobs change in the civil service. So actually proving to people that we are an industry that works together rather than separately gives a huge boost of confidence in the delivery of those projects. And it's something that when we are communicating the benefits of projects, that's a benefit not to be forgotten in that communication, because it really does, as I said, it just bolsters confidence that, some lone project isn't sort of just operating on its own, and, that there's that backup and confidence and funding and everything behind it to make sure it gets delivered. We've all seen, before, the last big crash, lots of building sites sort of half done, half finished because they weren't set up and funded properly. And we need to make sure that with this round of sort of, call it what you like, levelling up or regeneration, that we fill in some of those gaps and rebuild some of that confidence in this phase.
Thank you. I think we've potentially killed multiple birds with the answer to that question. So there's a couple of other questions here around the blockers, which I think we've covered off, an acceleration in your point, Fiona, around stakeholder engagement and comms, etc. Some of our other questions are quite specific. We have one from Esther, which seems to have been upvoted, which is there a cartogram for carbon consumption per head? And if so, what does that look like? I might sort of pull myself down to Helen and Tim at the bottom of my screen. I'm not sure whether you have that off the top of your heads and are able to answer that question.
I know we got it for the north, and what's quite interesting in the north is that actually it's the rural areas that have the more sort of per capita use largely because of dependency on road transport as opposed to public transport. But whether somebody's done that at an England level or a national level, I couldn't tell you. Helen may know.
Well, Emma just had a hand up.
Helen will give a much better and more intelligent answer.
About it.
So, the only thing I was going to flag is we've commissioned some work that we're hoping to publish shortly, actually, looking at some really specific data in terms of the Northwest and specifically around business carbon and so on. So happy to share that with all of you when that comes out.
All I would say from our perspective, I mean, we as infrastructure providers, per person type information, it's more what we do is kind of work with regional local authorities and stakeholders in their own ambitions and how infrastructure can support what they're looking to do. So in terms of the information that we have, it's that kind of level, and that's the work and the whole systems pieces that we've done is that's what it's kind of focused on.
Brilliant, thank you. It sounds like we've got a lot of reading materials that we can probably follow up on to give some of the insights to some of the questions that have come through. So again, we've got quite specific questions, but I want to pull us back to what we're here to speak to about today, which is on levelling up. So I've just pushed through one of the polls again, which is posing, what do you think are the main barriers of levelling up? So we've had quite a few responses. Again, to our audience, please do continue to feel free to vote on this respective poll. So some of the answers we've got here are lack of project delivery, capacity and capabilities, the continued focus on assets rather than outcomes, and inadequate or uneven measures of the problem and progress. I don't know whether I could come to Andy. I can see you slightly nodding there. I'm going to pick up on you there just to answer that question with your own thoughts.
Well, yeah, I think Tim mentioned it in his presentation. You've in Transport for the North, you've almost had to create your own measures of what levelling up means to you. Now, of course, levelling up's a great political slogan, and we use political slogans for different reasons. And here it's it's trying to achieve something as well as no doubt get some votes. But of course, at some point someone's going to have to say, is levelling up being delivered? And therefore you've got to measure what that is. I don't think it's impoverishing wealthy regions to benefit other regions, but probably it's something to do with the rate of growth. And I think this was in one of Tim's slides as well. It's the rate of growth of one area improving relative to another, and that's not the north versus the south. That could be Dover relative to Ashford, or it could be other parts of the country as well. We've also got sort of rural versus urban, but I think it's very difficult for someone to say we've been successful at levelling up unless we say precisely what we mean by that, and we can actually then go around measuring it without then getting into the issue where, of course, you measure something and we deliver to the measure rather than the outcome. So let's back to the first poll, agree what the outcome is, and then make sure we can measure and demonstrate we're delivering. Otherwise, probably everyone's going to be disappointed.
I think we had a hand up from Nick and Fiona, so we'll go with Nick.
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on the fact that the infrastructure strategy that was published is probably the most ambitious agenda in a generation. We will not deliver on it unless we really shape up across all the regions where we're going to see investment. So I noticed in the poll, one of the lowest votes was for productivity. Actually, if you look at UK construction, we're about 40% worse than manufacturing. And if I go to a construction site, they look pretty similar than they did 40 years ago, actually. And now we're out of the EU. I actually see this as the most fantastic opportunity, not just for the construction sector, but for the youth of the UK. Not only blue collar, but white collar. It's a fantastic opportunity to revolutionise, modernise and invest against the backdrop of the NIS, which is a long-term plan. So I can't think of a better and more exciting time to get everyone from folks in education thinking about what career they want to the construction sector themselves to modernise and digitise. And if we do that, I think it starts to address some of the blocks and barriers that are elsewhere the UK.
Nick, over to you, Fiona.
Thank you. So I just wanted to pick up that point around measurement of what levelling looks like in terms of success. And I think I want to put a spanner in the works and just say it's going to be an extremely difficult exercise to do. And I think that's because, again, from our research, what we found was when people were asked to describe what they thought levelling up meant from a public perspective, everyone had a different meaning. So levelling up means different things to different people. And picking up on Helen's excellent point around how her projects have been really focused on local aspirations, the aspirations of local people, is actually that's going to be the biggest marker of success for this scheme. Are the projects that we're delivering under the Levelling Up banner, are they meeting the expectations of what people in those communities want and think are their priorities? And unfortunately, then we get into a whole other layer of complexities that even within regions, those priorities are going to be hugely different. Take the West Midlands, for example, the priorities and aspirations of the Black Country are going to be hugely different to Birmingham, despite them sitting next to each other. I don't have an answer for how that's measured in terms of how do you respond back to government about how you've delivered on the investment or the funding that you've gained. But just picking up on Nick's point about it being a great opportunity, the situation that we're in at the moment is at the moment there is a really lack of awareness around plans and visions for the futures in local communities. Our research showing only around 27% of people feeling like they've actually been involved in a process at any one time. But on the flip side of that, we found that 76% of people would be encouraged to participate as long as it was on their own terms. And I think this is where perhaps in the past we've been a bit guilty of a one-size-fits-all approach to engagement. But as Nick said, this actually, the whole Levelling Up agenda is a great opportunity of getting a whole new generation of people. I don't mean that in age, just people who perhaps have just never been involved before, to understand development, to want to be part of it, to be part of the journey in that placemaking and really own those projects and own what the benefits are for them to help shape those projects. And ultimately, you know, development, in my opinion, it's a form of democracy. And, you know, if we build these things with government money often for communities, if those communities can then be involved in it, you're really energising a whole group of people who have perhaps never been engaged in a sort of civic exercise before. So there's loads of other sort of offshoot benefits to getting this agenda right, not just let's get some amazing infrastructure. And, you know, for anyone who's worked in sectors along the bar, I get excited when I see a big bridge go up. But, you know, for everyone else, there probably needs to be a bit more of a tangible reason why. But we've got such a great opportunity to really engage people who have never sort of had the opportunity to take ownership before. And that's going to have a great impact, especially on the sort of morale and well-being and self-confidence of some of these areas that have been targeted by the Levelling Up agenda.
Could not have said it better, Fiona. I think you probably rounded off our whole conversation beautifully, which actually brings us to the end of our event today. Just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us and all the conversations that we've had in the chat and the questions. Some of them were quite specific, so we didn't manage to get to all of them. I did say there was a wealth of knowledge in the room, and so there'd be a full-on conversation, but definitely encouraging people to continue the conversations in your respective teams, and to the points that were raised earlier around different sectors as well, making sure that we're tying in together and we're having these conversations, not just in our own silos, but we're making sure that we're building a better future and levelling up collectively. With that, I will end and pass over to Jonathan, who will close off the session for today. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks ever so much, Gabriella, and thank you to our amazing panel. That was fantastic. So thanks, Tim, Helen, Nick, Emma, Fiona, Andy, and of course to you, Gabriella. I'm sorry, I'd love to get the audience to clap you, but of course we can't hear them, which is one of the downsides of a webinar. This is the last in a current series of 4 MPA IPA events. We will be running a new series of a new cycle of 4 events starting in the summer, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Should be really exciting. Those of you that followed the last 4 events, you'll remember we covered the impact of the pandemic, leadership, project speed, and now levelling up. So we're not afraid to tackle some really big issues, and it's great fun to explore those. I've just put on the screen a slide with upcoming public events from the Major Projects Association. There are a couple of great ones on project analytics, a new series from the Sustainability Ambassadors starting on the 26th of May. And then we have another Cube at Work session on the 17th of June, which is in this amazing virtual world. So if you haven't experienced Cube at Work, then take a look at that. And you can find details of all of those on the association's website. So we're 15 seconds over time. And once again, thanks very much to the panel, to you, Gabriella, and thank you everybody who's listened in and joined in with questions and with ideas and responded to the polls. Thank you all very much indeed.